Thomas Mitchell had been a royal guard at Buckingham Palace for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. He knew this because he counted every single one of them. Standing at attention for hours, walking the same corridors, checking the same doors, it had become as natural as breathing. What he didn't expect on that Tuesday morning in March was to become the most talked about guard in royal history. The day started like any other. Thomas arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, his black uniform pressed to perfection, his boots polished until they gleamed. The morning briefing was routine: patrol schedules, visitor lists, weather updates. Nothing suggested that in a few hours he would be standing in Queen Camilla's private closet, holding a piece of British history that wasn't supposed to exist. It began with a maintenance request. The palace's aging heating system had been acting up, and several rooms in the royal quarters needed their vents checked. Thomas was assigned to escort the maintenance crew through the private areas, a job he'd done dozens of times before. The difference was that today, Queen Camilla was away on official duties, and her quarters were supposed to be completely empty. The maintenance supervisor, a cheerful man named Frank, who'd been working at the palace longer than Thomas had been alive, was examining a heating vent in the Queen's dressing room when he noticed something odd. "This vent's been tampered with," Frank muttered, running his fingers along the edges. "Look here, fresh screwdriver marks. Someone's been in this wall recently." Thomas stepped closer to examine the marks. Royal security took any sign of tampering seriously, even in what seemed like innocent maintenance areas. "How recently?" he asked, already reaching for his radio to report the finding. "Days, maybe a week at most," Frank replied, carefully removing the vent cover. But that's not the weird part. He peered into the opening, his expression changing from curiosity to confusion. "There's something in here. Something that definitely shouldn't be in a heating vent." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Security breaches at the palace were taken extremely seriously. He moved closer as Frank carefully reached into the vent opening. "Can you see what it is?" "It's fabric," Frank said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief. "Expensive fabric. And there's something else, feels like jewelry or metal of some kind." He looked at Thomas with wide eyes. "I think you better call this in before I pull anything out." But Thomas was already staring into the vent opening, and what he could see made his breath catch. Even in the dim light, the unmistakable shimmer of gold thread was visible. This wasn't just any fabric, this was something extraordinary. "Wait," he said quietly, his training warring with curiosity. "Let me get a flashlight." The beam of light revealed what Frank had been feeling. Carefully folded and wrapped in protective cloth was what appeared to be a garment of incredible craftsmanship. Gold embroidery caught the light, and Thomas could make out the edge of what looked like ermine trim. His knowledge of royal history wasn't extensive, but he'd seen enough ceremonial items during his time at the palace to recognize something significant when he saw it. "We need to document this before anyone else touches it," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "This could be important." Frank nodded, stepping back from the vent. "I've never seen anything like this in my 40 years of maintenance work. Why would someone hide something so valuable in a heating vent?" Thomas was already taking photos with his phone, making sure to capture the vent opening, the fabric visible inside, and the tampered screwdriver marks Frank had discovered. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." He reached for his radio again, then hesitated. Standard procedure would be to immediately report the find and wait for senior security to arrive. But something about the situation felt different. "Frank," he said slowly, "if this is what I think it might be, we could be looking at something that's been missing for a very long time." He made a decision that would change everything. "Help me get this out carefully. We'll document everything, but I want to see what we're dealing with before half the palace security team tramples through here." Working together, they carefully extracted the wrapped bundle from the vent. It was heavier than expected, and as they laid it on Queen Camilla's dressing table, Thomas felt the weight of history in his hands. The protective wrapping was modern plastic sheeting and acid-free tissue paper, suggesting someone had taken great care to preserve whatever was inside. "Should we open it?" Frank whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of the moment. Thomas looked around the elegant dressing room, with its mirrors and carefully arranged royal accessories. Queen Camilla's own ceremonial items hung nearby: tiaras, formal gowns, and pieces worn to state occasions. But what they'd found felt different, older, more significant. "We document everything first," Thomas said, taking more photos of the wrapped bundle. "Then we see what's inside." As his fingers worked to too carefully fold back the protective wrapping, Thomas had no idea that he was about to uncover one of the most closely guarded secrets in modern royal history. The fabric that emerged was beyond anything he had imagined, deep purple velvet that seemed to glow in the dressing room light. Embroidered with gold and silver in patterns so intricate they seemed to move before his eyes. But it was the ermine trim that made Thomas's hand shake as the full reality hit him. This wasn't just any ceremonial garment. This was a coronation robe. And if his suspicions were correct, it was a coronation robe that officially no longer existed. The silence in Queen Camillas' dressing room was broken only by the sound of Thomas's heart pounding in his ears. Frank stood motionless beside him, staring at the magnificent garment spread across the dressing table. Neither man spoke for several moments, both understanding they were looking at something that could rewrite royal history. Thomas reached for the small magnifying glass that sat among Queen Camillas' jewelry accessories. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the embroidery more closely. The gold threads formed the unmistakable pattern of the royal coat of arms. But there were subtle differences from the modern version he knew. The style was distinctly from an earlier era, and the craftsmanship was beyond anything he had seen in contemporary royal regalia. "Look at this," he whispered to Frank, pointing to a section of embroidery near what would be the neckline. "These aren't just random decorative elements. These symbols tell a story." Frank leaned in closer, his maintenance expertise suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the historical puzzle before them. What kind of story? Thomas had spent his off-duty hours reading about royal history, a hobby that had started as professional interest, but had grown into genuine fascination. Coronation robes are made specifically for each monarch. They're never reused, and they're supposed to be carefully preserved in the royal collection. He paused, studying the garment. "But this one isn't in any official inventory I've ever read about." The implications were staggering. Thomas pulled out his phone again, this time opening the camera app to record a video as he spoke. Documentation log, March 15th, 2024. Royal Guard Thomas. Mitchell and Maintenance Supervisor Frank Patterson have discovered what appears to be an undocumented coronation robe hidden in the heating vent of Queen Camillas' dressing room. Frank watched nervously. As Thomas continued recording, the garment shows characteristics consistent with mid to late 20th century royal ceremonial wear, but with design elements that suggest it was intended for a specific coronation that ... Osh paused, the weight of his suspicion almost too significant to voice, that may never have officially taken place. The more Thomas examined the robe, the more convinced he became of its authenticity. The weight of the velvet, the quality of the gold thread, the precision of the ermine placement, these weren't things that could be easily faked. Especially not to the standard that would fool someone with his experience of royal ceremonial items. "We need to check for any identifying marks," Thomas said, carefully lifting sections of the robe to examine the lining. Royal garments always have some form of maker's mark or commissioning date. Frank pointed to a section near the hem. "There's something here. It looks like writing, but it's very small." Thomas positioned the magnifying glass over the area Frank had indicated. What he saw made his breath catch. Embroidered in nearly invisible silver thread along the inner hem were the words for Her Majesty's private coronation. 1952. 1952, Thomas repeated slowly. "That's the year Queen Elizabeth was crowned, but ... He stopped, his mind racing through the historical timeline he knew so well. This can't be right. There was only one coronation in 1952, and it was very public. Westminster Abbey, television coverage, the whole world watching. Frank frowned. So what's a private coronation? Thomas was already reaching for his phone again, this time to search for any historical references to multiple coronations in 1952. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. But the search results showed exactly what he expected: comprehensive coverage of the single public coronation ceremony that had established Queen Elizabeth II on the throne. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. But even as he said it, pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form in his mind. Unless, he looked up at Frank with wide eyes. What if there was something that happened before the public ceremony? Something that needed to be kept secret? The possibility sent chills down Thomas's spine. Royal protocols were complex, and there were aspects of monarchy that the public never learned about. Could there have been a private ceremony that preceded the famous public coronation? And if so, why would evidence of it be hidden in a heating vent in Queen Camillas' quarters? We need to examine this more thoroughly, Thomas said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used during security briefings. But we also need to be smart about this. If this robe is what I think it is, it could be one of the most significant historical discoveries in modern royal history. Or it could get us both fired for touching something we weren't supposed to find. Thomas carefully photographed the embroidered date and the maker's marks he was discovering. Each new detail seemed to authenticate the garment further, but also deepen the mystery of why it was hidden. Look at this, he said, pointing to another section of the lining. There's a date here too, but it's different. This one says June 2nd, 1953. That's almost a year later, Frank observed. Why would there be two dates on the same garment? Thomas's historical knowledge was being pushed to its limits, but he was beginning to form a theory that seemed impossible, yet increasingly plausible. What if this robe was made for a ceremony that was supposed to happen in 1952, but was actually used for something else in 1953? The more they discovered, the more questions arose. Thomas found himself wondering who had hidden the robe, when it had been placed in the vent, and most importantly, why it had ended up in Queen Camillas' quarters. Was she aware of its existence? Had she been the one to hide it, or had someone else used her private space as a secret storage location? Frank Thomas said quietly, I think we need to make a decision here. Do we report this immediately and let the Royal Archives Department handle it, or do we try to understand what we found before it disappears into official channels? Frank looked uncomfortable with the weight of the decision. What do you think could happen if we don't report it right away? Thomas considered the question carefully. If this robe is evidence of some kind of secret royal ceremony, reporting it immediately might mean we never learn the truth. Official channels have a way of making inconvenient historical facts disappear. He paused, looking at the magnificent garment. But if we investigate further on our own, we could be risking our careers. Or worse. The decision would prove to be one of the most important moments in both their lives, though neither man could know it yet. Thomas made his choice with the kind of decisive clarity that had made him an excellent royal guard. We investigate first, but we do it properly. No rushing, no guessing, and we document everything. He looked at Frank seriously. Are you willing to be part of this? Frank nodded slowly. I've worked in this palace for 40 years without ever finding anything more interesting than loose change behind radiators. I'm not walking away from this now. Thomas began systematically photographing every detail of the robe, from the overall design to the smallest decorative elements. His security training had taught him the importance of thorough documentation, and he applied those skills now with methodical precision. We need to research these dates and find out what was happening in the royal family during those specific times. While Thomas worked with his camera, Frank examined the heating vent more carefully. You know what's strange? He said, running his hands along the interior walls. This vent has been modified. Look here. Someone installed a custom shelf inside, specifically designed to hold something the size of this bundle. Thomas looked up from his photography. So this wasn't just hastily hidden. Someone planned this storage location. Exactly. And the modification work is professional quality. This took time and skill to do properly. Frank pointed to small brackets that had been carefully welded inside the vent. Someone wanted to make sure whatever was stored here would be safe and undamaged. The revelation added another layer to the mystery. This wasn't the work of someone acting in panic or desperation. Someone had deliberately created a secret storage space in the royal quarters, which suggested they had both the access and the authority to make such modifications. Without being questioned, Thomas finished his initial photography, and pulled out a small notebook he always carried for security reports. Let's think about this logically. We have a coronation robe with two dates, 1952 and 1953. We have evidence it was deliberately hidden in a custom storage space, and we found it in Queen Camillas' private quarters. He began writing as he spoke. Question 1. Was Queen Camilla involved in hiding this, or did someone else use her space? Question 2. What happened in 1952 and 1953 that would require a secret coronation robe? Question 3. Why preserve it so carefully instead of destroying it? Frank watched Thomas work with growing admiration. You're treating this like a proper investigation, because that's what it is, Thomas replied. And if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. He looked at the robe again, noting details he had missed in his initial examination. Frank, look at this embroidery pattern around the collar. I've seen something similar before. Thomas pulled out his phone and searched through photos he had taken during various royal ceremonies. Here, he said, showing Frank a picture from a state dinner. Look at Queen Elizabeth's ceremonial sash. See how the pattern is almost identical, but not quite? Frank squinted at the phone screen. They look like variations of the same design. Exactly. Which suggests this robe was made by the same workshops that created other royal ceremonial items, but with deliberate differences. Thomas felt the excitement of discovery building. This supports the authenticity, but it also suggests the robe was meant to be distinct from official regalia. They spent the next hour conducting what Thomas called a proper examination. He measured the robe, documented every symbol and decorative element, and created a detailed written description of its construction. Frank, meanwhile, thoroughly examined the heating vent and discovered that the modification had been done with considerable expertise. Whoever installed this storage space knew exactly what they were doing, Frank reported. The ventilation still works perfectly, but there's this hidden compartment that's climate-controlled and protected from moisture. This is preservation quality storage. Thomas looked up from his notes, which means whoever hid this wanted it to survive for a very long time. He paused, considering the implications. Frank, what if this robe wasn't meant to be discovered by accident? What if someone intended for it to be found eventually, but only by the right person at the right time? The possibility sent a chill through both men. Thomas examined the robe's positioning when they had found it. It was wrapped and placed very deliberately, almost like it was waiting for someone. Frank nodded slowly. And the maintenance request that brought us here today, it was specifically for this room. The heating problem could have been handled from other vents, but the work order specifically mentioned checking the vent in the dressing room. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Who submitted the work order? Frank pulled out his tablet and scrolled through the day's assignments. It came through the standard channels, but ... His face went pale as he read the details. It's marked as a priority request from the Queen's private secretary. But there's no signature or specific authorization code. So someone wanted us to find this, Thomas said quietly. The question is who and why now? They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Thomas quickly but carefully rewrapped the robe in its protective covering, while Frank hastily replaced the vent cover. Both men tried to look as though they were conducting routine maintenance, but Thomas's heart was racing. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the near miss reminded them both of the risk they were taking. We can't do this here, Thomas whispered. Too many people have access to these rooms. Frank nodded. My workshop in the basement. It's private, and I have proper lighting and tools if we need to examine anything more closely. Thomas carefully gathered the rewrapped robe. We move this tonight, after the evening shift change. Fewer people around, and my security clearance will get us through any checkpoints. As they prepared to return the robe temporarily to its hiding place, Thomas noticed something they had missed earlier. A small envelope had been tucked beneath the fabric, so thin it had been virtually invisible. With trembling fingers, he extracted it from its hiding place. The envelope was made of heavy cream paper, with what appeared to be a royal seal pressed into the wax that held it closed. But most shocking of all was the writing on the front. An elegant script that looked both formal and personal, for the guardian who seeks the truth. Thomas and Frank stared at the envelope in stunned silence, both realizing they had just crossed a line from accidental discovery into something that felt very much like destiny. The evening shift change at Buckingham Palace happened with military precision at 8 p.m. Thomas had timed his movements carefully, waiting until the corridors were at their quietest before making his way to Frank's basement workshop. The sealed envelope felt like it was burning a hole in his jacket pocket, but he forced himself to maintain his usual professional demeanor as he passed. The few remaining staff members, Frank's workshop was exactly what Thomas had expected, a cluttered but organized space filled with the tools and supplies needed to maintain one of the world's most famous buildings. More importantly, it was private, secure, and far from the eyes of curious palace staff. Frank had already cleared a large work table and set up proper lighting for their investigation. "I haven't been able to think about anything else," Frank admitted as Thomas carefully placed the rewrapped robe on the table. "I keep wondering who wrote that envelope and how long it's been waiting there." Thomas removed the envelope from his pocket with the same care he might handle a piece of evidence at a crime scene. The royal seal pressed into the wax was genuine. His experience with official palace documents taught him to recognize authentic royal seals from replicas. But this seal was different from the current royal seal, subtly but distinctly from an earlier era. "Before we open this," Thomas said, "we need to photograph everything exactly as we found it. The envelope, the seal, even the way it was positioned with the robe." He had brought a professional camera from the security office. Borrowed under the pretense of documenting maintenance issues, Frank watched as Thomas methodically documented every detail. "You're treating this like it's going to end up in a courtroom." "It might," Thomas replied seriously. "If this robe is what I think it is, and if that envelope contains what I suspect it might, we could be dealing with information that challenges official royal history. That's not something to approach lightly." After completing his photography, Thomas carefully examined the wax seal under a magnifying glass. The seal shows the royal arms, but with variations I haven't seen before. Look at the positioning of the crown. It's slightly different from both the current royal seal and the one used during Queen Elizabeth's early reign. What do you think that means? "I think it means this envelope was sealed by someone with royal authority, but someone whose position wasn't part of the official record." Thomas paused, considering his words carefully. "Someone who had the right to use royal seals, but needed to keep their actions secret." With infinite care, Thomas began to warm the wax seal with a small heat lamp from Frank's equipment. His goal was to soften the wax enough to remove it intact, preserving both the envelope's contents and the seal itself as evidence of authenticity. "There," he whispered as the seal came free. "Now we see what someone wanted the guardian who seeks the truth to know." Inside the envelope were 3 items: a handwritten letter on official royal stationery, a small black and white photograph, and what appeared to be an official document with multiple signatures. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the letter. Recognizing immediately that the handwriting belonged to someone accustomed to formal correspondence, read it aloud, Frank urged quietly. Thomas cleared his throat and began, "To whoever discovers this record, I pray you are indeed a seeker of truth. For what you have found represents one of the most closely guarded secrets in modern royal history." He paused, looking at Frank with wide eyes. "This is signed Margaret, our Princess Margaret," Frank breathed. "The Queen's sister." Thomas continued reading. "The coronation robe you have discovered was created for a ceremony that history will never record. A private coronation held for my sister, Elizabeth, on June 2nd, 1953, exactly 1 year after her public coronation at Westminster Abbey. The need for this second ceremony arose from circumstances that required absolute secrecy. Circumstances that I pray time will eventually allow to be understood." Frank gripped the edge of the work table. A second coronation. Why would Queen Elizabeth need to be crowned twice? Thomas kept reading. The official ceremony in 1952 was incomplete in ways that only those closest to the crown understood. Legal and constitutional issues arose after the public coronation that required a private ceremony to ensure the legitimacy of Elizabeth's reign. This robe was worn during that secret ceremony, attended by only 5 witnesses, all of whom swore sacred oaths of silence. The letter continued, "I have hidden this record because I believe history deserves truth, even when truth is inconvenient for the monarchy." The private ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the private chapel at Windsor Castle. The legal documents confirming the ceremony's validity are secured separately. But this robe and its documentation serve as proof that the ceremony occurred. Thomas's voice grew quieter as he read the final paragraph. "I trust that whoever finds this will understand both the historical importance of this discovery and the delicate nature of its implications. The monarchy's legitimacy has never been in question, but the full truth of how that legitimacy was secured deserves to be preserved for future generations who may be better positioned to reveal it publicly." Frank was staring at the letter as if it might vanish. Legal and constitutional issues? What kind of issues would require a secret coronation? Thomas picked up the photograph that had been in the envelope. It showed a small, intimate ceremony in what was clearly Windsor Castle's private chapel. A figure in the coronation robe they had discovered stood before an altar, with 5 other people in formal dress watching from nearby chairs. The image was slightly blurred, suggesting it had been taken quickly or in low-light conditions. "This photograph proves the ceremony happened," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "And look at the people attending. I recognize at least 2 of them from historical photographs, high-ranking church officials, and what looks like a senior judge." The official document was the most shocking discovery of all. It appeared to be a certificate of coronation, dated June 2, 1953, with 5 witness signatures and an official seal. The document was titled "Private Ceremony of Constitutional Confirmation," and included legal language that Thomas didn't fully understand but recognized as extremely formal and official. "Frank," Thomas said slowly, "we're not just looking at a hidden piece of royal history. We're looking at evidence that the official version of Queen Elizabeth's coronation isn't the complete story." Frank shook his head in amazement. "So what do we do now? This is way beyond maintenance work or security protocols." Thomas carefully arranged the documents and photograph alongside the robe, creating a complete record of their discovery. "Now, we need to verify everything. We need to research the legal issues Princess Margaret mentioned, confirm the authenticity of these documents, and understand what really happened in 1953. But even as he spoke, Thomas realized they were facing a dilemma that went far beyond historical curiosity. They had discovered evidence that could potentially rewrite royal history, and they had no idea who they could trust with such explosive information. The implications were staggering, and Thomas knew that their next decision would determine not only their own futures, but possibly the future of the British monarchy itself. Thomas spent the entire night researching, his laptop open beside the historical documents spread across Frank's workbench. What he discovered in obscure legal archives and parliamentary records began to paint a picture that made Princess Margaret's letter not only believable, but inevitable. "Frank," he called across the workshop where his friend was examining the robe under specialized lighting, "I think I've found what Princess Margaret was referring to. Look at this parliamentary debate from late 1952. Frank set down his magnifying glass and joined Thomas at the laptop. On the screen was a digitized record from the House of Lords, showing a heated discussion about constitutional irregularities in the coronation ceremony. The debate had been marked classified until 1995, and even now, large portions were redacted. "Listen to this," Thomas read aloud. Lord Salisbury is quoted as saying, "The ceremony as conducted may not have fulfilled all necessary constitutional requirements, particularly regarding the sacred oaths administered." And here, the Archbishop of Canterbury responds that certain elements of the traditional ceremony were modified due to unprecedented circumstances. Frank frowned as he followed along. What kind of modifications would require a secret do-over ceremony? Thomas clicked through several more archived documents. "I'm finding references to a constitutional review that happened in early 1953, and recommendations for additional ceremonial confirmation. To address technical deficiencies in the original coronation, the pieces were beginning to fit together." Thomas discovered that in late 1952, Several constitutional scholars had raised questions about whether certain traditional elements of the coronation ceremony had been properly observed. The issues seemed to center around the specific wording of oaths and the presence of certain religious artifacts that had historical significance for the validity of the ceremony. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing to another document. A memo from the Prime Minister's office in January 1953 refers to resolving the constitutional matter through private ceremony and mentions the need for absolute discretion to avoid public confusion about Her Majesty's legitimacy. Frank was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had discovered. So the public coronation in 1952 was legally incomplete somehow, and they had to do it again privately to make sure it was constitutionally valid. Exactly. And they couldn't let the public know because it would have raised questions about whether Queen Elizabeth was properly crowned the first time. Thomas leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Princess Margaret preserved this evidence because she knew history would eventually want to understand what really happened. Frank returned to his examination of the robe, but his focus had shifted to details that might corroborate the story they were uncovering. "Thomas, come look at this. I've been studying the stitching and construction, and there are some very specific details that support the timeline in these documents." Thomas joined Frank at the work table, where the robe was spread under bright lights. Frank pointed to several areas where the embroidery showed subtle but distinct characteristics. "This gold thread here," Frank explained. "It's a specific type that was only used for royal garments during a very short period in the early 1950s. And look at this. The embroidery pattern includes symbols that I've seen in photographs from Queen Elizabeth's private chapel services, but not from the public coronation." Frank's expertise in palace maintenance had given him an unexpected knowledge of royal artifacts and their construction. Most importantly, there are wear patterns on this robe that show it was definitely worn, but only once or twice. This isn't a replica or a display piece. This was a working ceremonial garment. Thomas photographed the details Frank was pointing out, adding them to his growing documentation file. "We now have historical documents, parliamentary records, and physical evidence that all support the same story. The question is what we do with this information." They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the workshop. Both men froze as the steps approached, but then continued past without stopping. The near miss reminded them that they were still operating in secret, and that discovery could have serious consequences. "We need to think about this strategically," Thomas said quietly. "This information could be explosive if it's released publicly, but it could also be suppressed if we go through official channels." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "What about contacting historians or journalists who specialize in royal history? People who would understand the significance and treat it responsibly." Thomas had been considering the same possibility. "There's a historian at Cambridge who's written extensively about constitutional law and royal ceremonies, Dr. Sarah Pemberton. She might be someone we could trust with this information." But even as he suggested it, Thomas felt the weight of the decision they were facing. They were two palace employees who had stumbled onto information that could change how the world understood British royal history. The responsibility was enormous, and the potential consequences were equally significant. "Before we contact anyone," Thomas said, "we need to complete our documentation and make sure we have copies of everything stored safely. If this information is as important as it seems, we need to protect it." Frank agreed, and they spent the next several hours creating detailed photographic records of every document, every detail of the robe, and every piece of evidence they had discovered. Thomas uploaded encrypted copies to a secure cloud storage service, while Frank created physical copies using the palace's high-quality document scanner. As dawn approached, they carefully rewrapped the robe and prepared to return it to its hiding place. But Thomas paused before closing the protective wrapping. "Frank," he said slowly, "I just realized something. The envelope was addressed to the guardian who seeks the truth. Princess Margaret wasn't just hiding this randomly. She was leaving it for someone specific. Someone she believed would handle it properly. Frank considered this. So she wanted it to be found, but only by the right person." "Exactly. and the fact that it was hidden in Queen Camilla's quarters might not be coincidental. Thomas felt a new understanding beginning to form. What if Princess Margaret chose that location because she believed Queen Camilla or someone close to her would eventually be in a position to handle this information appropriately? The possibility added yet another layer to their discovery. They weren't just accidental finders of hidden history. They might be part of a plan that Princess Margaret had set in motion decades ago. A plan to ensure that the truth about Queen Elizabeth's coronation would eventually come to light when the time was right. As they prepared to leave the workshop, Thomas knew their investigation was far from over. They had uncovered the evidence, but now they needed to decide how to honor Princess Margaret's trust and ensure that this remarkable piece of royal history received the attention it deserved. 3 days after their discovery, Thomas Mitchell stood in Dr. Sarah Pemberton's office at Cambridge University, watching one of Britain's foremost royal historians examine the photographs and documents he had brought. Frank had remained at the palace, maintaining their normal routines to avoid suspicion, while Thomas took personal leave to pursue what he now understood might be the most important historical revelation of his lifetime. Dr. Pemberton had spent 2 hours studying every detail of Thomas's documentation without speaking. Her office was filled with books on constitutional law and royal history, and her reputation for discretion and scholarly integrity had made her Thomas's first choice for sharing their discovery. Finally, she looked up from her examination with an expression of profound amazement. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "if this documentation is authentic, and everything I'm seeing suggests it is, you've discovered evidence of one of the most significant constitutional secrets in modern British history." Thomas felt his heart racing as she continued. "I've spent 20 years studying the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and I've always suspected there were gaps in the official record. Constitutional law from that period is extraordinarily complex, and there were legitimate concerns about whether the 1952 ceremony met all traditional requirements." Dr. Pemberton pulled several thick books from her shelves and opened them to marked pages. "Look at these parliamentary debates from early 1953. I've always wondered why there were so many references to resolving constitutional matters and ensuring proper ceremony, but the official explanations never made complete sense." She showed Thomas's historical records he hadn't been able to access through public archives. The constitutional issues Princess Margaret mentioned in her letter were real and serious. Several legal scholars had raised concerns about modified oath language in the absence of certain traditional ceremonial elements from the public coronation. Thomas listened intently as Dr. Pemberton explained the historical context. In 1952, there were practical reasons why the public coronation couldn't include every traditional element. Television coverage limited certain aspects of the ceremony, and post-war sensitivities meant some historical elements were considered inappropriate for public viewing. But constitutionally, those elements may have been necessary for the coronation to be considered fully legitimate. The scholarly validation of their discovery was both thrilling and overwhelming. Thomas realized they weren't just dealing with an interesting historical curiosity. They had uncovered evidence of a deliberate effort by the royal family and government to ensure Queen Elizabeth's constitutional legitimacy while avoiding public confusion or controversy. "Dr. Pemberton," Thomas asked carefully, "what should be done with this information?" She considered the question thoughtfully. "That depends on what you hope to achieve. This discovery has enormous historical value, but it also has potential implications for current constitutional understanding." She paused, looking at the photographs of Princess Margaret's letter. Princess Margaret clearly intended for this information to be preserved and eventually revealed. "The question is whether now is the appropriate time," Dr. Pemberton made several phone calls while Thomas waited, contacting colleagues who specialized in different aspects of royal history and constitutional law. By the end of the afternoon, she had assembled an informal advisory group of 3 other historians who could provide guidance on how to handle such sensitive historical information. "We need to approach this systematically," Dr. Pemberton explained. "First, we should have the physical documents and robe examined by conservation experts to confirm their authenticity. Second, We need to research the legal implications of revealing this information. Third, we should consider consulting with appropriate royal officials about the proper way to handle historical discoveries of this magnitude. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and anxiety about involving more people in their discovery. What about the fact that Frank and I technically removed royal property from the palace? Could we face legal consequences for that? Dr. Pemberton smiled reassuringly. You documented everything properly. You haven't damaged or stolen anything. Your discovery has clear historical importance. Most importantly, Princess Margaret's letter suggests this information was meant to be found and revealed, I believe. Any reasonable authority would recognize that you've acted responsibly. Over the following weeks, Dr. Pemberton coordinated a careful and scholarly approach to verifying and understanding Thomas and Frank's discovery. Conservation experts confirmed that the robe and documents were authentic and consistent with their claimed dates. Constitutional lawyers reviewed the legal implications and concluded that the information, while historically significant, didn't challenge Queen Elizabeth's legitimacy or create any current legal issues. Most importantly, Dr. Pemberton facilitated a discreet consultation with the Royal Archives, where senior historians and palace officials could review the discovery in an appropriate context. The response was surprising, rather than attempting to suppress the information. The palace historians were genuinely grateful for the discovery and excited about its historical significance. It appears, Dr. Pemberton told Thomas during their final meeting, that you've solved a historical puzzle that royal historians have been wondering about for decades. The palace archives have references to the constitutional concerns from 1953, but they never had confirmation of how those concerns were resolved. Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction as Dr. Pemberton continued. Princess Margaret's preservation of this evidence was remarkably foresighted. She understood that historical truth is important, even when that truth is complex or sensitive. The resolution came 6 months after Thomas's original discovery. The Royal Historical Society published a carefully researched paper documenting the 1953 private coronation ceremony based on the evidence Thomas and Frank had discovered. The revelation was treated as a fascinating footnote to Queen Elizabeth's reign rather than a scandal, with constitutional experts explaining that additional ceremonies to ensure legal completeness were not uncommon in royal history. Thomas Mitchell returned to his duties as a royal guard with a new understanding of his role as a guardian of history as well as security. Frank Patterson continued his maintenance work, with the satisfaction of knowing he had played a part in one of the most significant historical discoveries of the modern era, and in Queen Camillas' dressing room. The heating vent was properly repaired and returned to normal service, its secret finally revealed after more than 70 years of patient waiting. Princess Margaret's trust in future guardians who seek the truth had been vindicated, and a missing piece of royal history had found its proper place in the historical record. The coronation robe itself was eventually transferred to the royal collection, where it joined other ceremonial garments in the official archives. But for Thomas Mitchell, the real treasure had been the opportunity to honor Princess Margaret's faith that the truth, given time and the right circumstances, would always find a way to emerge.